Stay awake, Naomi.
Look at me!
Don't you dare close your eyes.
The rhythmic click of rolling suitcases and monotone boarding announcements at Incheon International Airport shattered at exactly 10:14 a.m. In a spray of glass that fell like crystalline rain, Naomi Carter hit the polished terminal floor, her patterned blouse blooming with a sudden, violent red. Security footage would later capture the cold precision of the three masked men, professional, detached, and vanishing before the first scream ended. As the airport police scrambled to apply pressure to the wound, they reached for her identification. But what stopped them, what would eventually stop the entire city of Seoul, wasn't her passport. It was the custom leather wallet she clutched, embossed with a silver, golden dragon sigil, and the platinum wedding band on her finger engraved with a single, possessive word, mine. 3 years earlier, Park Ji-Hoon wasn't supposed to be in a rain-slicked alleyway in Itaewon. He had walked away from an ambush with a knife wound he refused to acknowledge, his expensive black suit ruined by the grit of the street. His strategists had begged him to call their private surgeons, but Ji-Hoon needed the shadows of the city. "Sit down before you bleed out on my favorite shortcut," a voice said from the darkness. It was firm, carrying a Georgia lilt that made his shoulders drop their guard. Ji-Hoon turned slowly, expecting the usual fear or trembling apology. Instead, he found Naomi Carter, standing with a first aid kit and a look of pure, unimpressed exhaustion. "I don't need help," Ji-Hoon said, his English precise and cold. "Well, tonight you're getting it anyway," Naomi replied, already kneeling to clean the wound. "Stoic men aren't special in this neighborhood. I see 10 of you a week." Something shifted in Ji-Hoon's chest, a crack in the armor he had spent 20 years forging with iron and silence. She didn't know he was the man who decided who lived and died in Seoul, she just saw a man who was hurting. "What is your name?" he pressed as she taped the bandage with gentle, steady hands. "Naomi," she said, finally meeting his gaze. The connection was sudden, a spark of light in an alleyway built for darkness. "Naomi," Ji-Hoon repeated, the name feeling foreign yet right on his tongue. "I plan to remember it." The transition from the sterile, blood-slicked terminal floor to the rain-drenched memory of 3 years ago feels like a jagged tear in time. Before the chaos of the airport, before the golden dragon sigil became a mark of both protection and peril, there was only the smell of wet asphalt and the low hum of Seoul's Itaewon district at midnight. Park Ji-Hoon was bleeding then, too. He moved through the narrow alleyway with a gait that should have been a stumble but remained a predatory glide. The knife wound in his side was a hot, pulsing line of fire that had sliced through a $3,000 suit jacket and the skin beneath. Behind him, the sounds of his pursuers were fading, lost in the labyrinth of the city, but the cold strategist knew he was running out of time. He didn't need a hospital meant records, and records meant vulnerability. He needed a shadow to hide in. Instead, he found a light. Naomi Carter was cutting through the alley on her way back from a late shift, her first aid kit slung over her shoulder like a crossbody bag. She was tired, her mind drifting to the comfort of her small apartment and the calls she needed to make back home to Georgia. When she saw the tall, imposing figure leaning against a brick wall, his hand pressed firmly against his side, her instincts didn't scream, "Run." They screamed, "Help." "Sit down before you bleed out on my favorite shortcut," she said. Her voice was a warm contrast to the biting wind, a soft southern lilt that cut through the tension of the night. Ji-Hoon stiffened, his eyes narrowing into flinty shards of obsidian. He was a man who commanded rooms with a glance, a man who saw everyone as either a tool or a threat. He didn't recognize the woman standing before him, her skin the color of deep mahogany, her eyes wide with a mixture of concern and stubbornness. She didn't cower. She didn't bow. "I don't need help," Ji-Hoon said, his English precise, his tone a warning that usually sent men scrambling for cover. "Well, tonight you're getting it anyway," Naomi countered. She stepped into his personal space with a fearlessness that momentarily stunned him. Stoic men aren't special in this neighborhood. I see 10 of you a week trying to act like you're made of stone. She didn't wait for his permission. With the practiced efficiency of a woman used to dealing with the stubborn and the broken, she guided him toward a stack of crates. To his own surprise, Ji-Hoon let her. There was something about the way she moved, unhurried, intentional, that bypassed his internal alarms. As she knelt before him, opening her kit, the glow of a nearby neon sign bathed them in flickering hues of pink and blue. She worked with a gentle, steady hand, peeling back the ruined fabric of his shirt. Ji-Hoon watched her, his breath hitching not from the pain of the antiseptic, but from the proximity of her. She was so close he could smell the faint scent of cocoa butter and rain on her skin. You're a long way from home, Naomi, he said quietly, reading the name tag still pinned to her sweater. And you're a long way from whatever boardroom or backroom you crawled out of, she replied, finally meeting his gaze. For a heartbeat, the city around them ceased to exist. In her eyes, Ji-Hoon didn't see the most feared boss of the underworld. He didn't see a strategist or a dragon. He saw a man who was hurting, a man who was lonely, and a man who was, for the first time in 15 years, utterly captivated. The connection hit him like a physical blow, more profound than the blade that had pierced his side. It was a spark of pure, unadulterated humanity in a life built on shadows and silence. What is your name? He pressed, his voice losing its icy edge. Naomi, she repeated, as if sensing the weight he was placing on the word. She finished taping the bandage, her fingers lingering for a second too long against his skin. And you should probably go home and stay there, Mr. Mystery. Ji-Hoon stood up, the pain now a dull throb compared to the sudden ache of wanting to stay in this alleyway forever. He looked at her, really looked at her, and realized that the separate universes he lived in were about to collide. Naomi, he said, the name feeling like a sacred vow. I plan to remember it. She laughed, a rich, disbelieving sound that echoed off the brick walls. You're forward and probably dangerous. I can always tell. So why are you still standing here? The question hung between them like wood smoke, a challenge and an invitation all at once. Ji-Hoon didn't answer with words. He simply turned and walked back into the darkness, but his posture was no longer that of a hunted man. He was a man with a destination. He was a man who had finally found something worth protecting. In the weeks that followed that rain-slicked encounter, Naomi began to notice a series of strange, almost miraculous shifts in the fabric of her daily life. She chalked it up to a sudden streak of divine luck, never suspecting that the man from the alleyway was now moving through her world like a silent, invisible tide, reshaping everything he touched. The first change came with her commute. For months, the walk from the subway to her apartment had been a gauntlet of flickering streetlights and predatory shadows. Then, overnight, the alleyway was bathed in the warm, reliable glow of high-end LED security lamps. A municipal upgrade, the neighborhood council claimed, though the work had been completed in a single, quiet night by men in unmarked coveralls who moved with the precision of a private militia. Naomi felt a weight lift off her shoulders as she walked home, unaware that 3 blocks away, Ji-Hoon sat in the back of a darkened sedan, watching her progress on a digital map, his eyes tracing the pulse of her movement until she was safely behind her locked door. Then there was the matter of her sister's tuition back in Georgia. Naomi had been working double shifts, her eyes perpetually rimmed with exhaustion, trying to bridge the gap in the final semester's payments. She had spent her lunch breaks crying in the break room, staring at a bank balance that refused to grow. On a Tuesday morning, she received a frantic, joyous call from home. An anonymous, Global Excellence Scholarship had been applied to her sister's account, covering not only the tuition but the housing fees as well. They said I was selected for my community service records, her sister sobbed through the phone. Naomi sat on a park bench and wept with relief, never seeing the man in the sharp black turtleneck standing 100 yards away behind the tinted glass of a high-rise window. Ji-Hoon had spent an entire afternoon personally reviewing the university's financial portal, ensuring the digital trail was untraceable. To him, the cost was a rounding error; to her, it was the sun breaking through a decade of clouds. His courtship was a masterclass in strategic restraint. He didn't send roses; roses were loud, and roses required questions. Instead, he made sure the world was softer for her. When her favorite bakery was on the verge of closing due to rising rents, a new, silent investor stepped in, and the price of Naomi's morning coffee mysteriously dropped by half. When a group of local thugs began harassing the street vendors near her workplace, they simply vanished, replaced by a new, private security firm that stood at the corners with stone-faced discipline and eyes that never left the horizon. Ji-Hoon watched the transformation in her from a distance. He saw the color return to her cheeks as the stress of survival began to fade. He saw her smile more often, a rich, genuine expression that made his chest tighten with a possessiveness that frightened him. He was a man who lived by the blade and the ledger, a man who calculated risk with cold efficiency, yet he found himself spending hours orchestrating the minute details of a woman's comfort. He began to show up in her life like a recurring melody, always at the edge of her vision. He would be at the corner of a gallery she visited, or sitting at the back of a dim restaurant where she took herself for dinner. He never approached first; he waited for her to notice him. And when she did, his stern expression would soften by a fraction, a silent admission that he was drawn to her light. "You again," she said one evening, finding him standing near the Han River as the sun dipped below the skyline. "I'm starting to think you're following me, Mr. Mystery." "The city is smaller than it looks, Naomi," he replied, his English smooth and intentional. He didn't tell her that he had cleared the surrounding 300 yards of civilians so they could have this moment of quiet. "You look different," she noted, stepping closer, her eyes searching his face. "Less hunted." "Perhaps the hunter found something better to do with his time," Ji-Hoon said. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face before he caught himself and pulled back. The restraint was a physical ache. He wanted to pull her into his world, to surround her with the full force of his power, but he knew the truth: to touch the sun was to risk extinguishing it. "I don't even know what you do," she whispered, the wind whipping her dark curls around her face. "I solve problems," he said simply. Naomi laughed, a sound that felt like music to a man who lived in silence. "Well, keep doing it. Whatever you're doing, the world feels a little kinder lately." Ji-Hoon watched her walk away, her silhouette framed by the glowing lights of Seoul. He knew he was playing a dangerous game. He was the most feared man in the city, a wolf trying to live in the garden of a lamb. But as he adjusted his black suit and signaled for his men to move in behind her, he knew there was no turning back. He wasn't just her protector anymore, he was her architect. And he would build a world for her, even if he had to burn his own to do it. The transition from Mr. Mystery to husband happened in the quietest room of a centuries-old temple on the outskirts of Seoul, far from the neon glare of Gangnam and the prying eyes of the dragon's rivals. There were no cameras, no sprawling guest lists, and no grand ballroom. Instead, the air was thick with the scent of ancient cedar and burning incense, a stillness so profound it felt as though time itself had paused to witness the merging of two incompatible lives. Naomi stood before Ji-Hoon, dressed in a simple white silk gown that draped over her curves like a waterfall. She looked ethereal in the dim light of the paper lanterns, a stark contrast to the man standing across from her. Ji-Hoon wore his signature black suit, but his usual armor of cold indifference had been replaced by a raw, quiet intensity. For the first time, he wasn't looking at the world as a board to be manipulated, he was looking at her as his entire world. The ceremony was brief, conducted by a monk who had known Ji-Hoon's family for generations, a man who saw the scars on the groom's soul but chose to bless the union anyway. When it came time to exchange rings, Ji-Hoon's hands, usually steady enough to lead an empire, trembled ever so slightly. He slid the platinum band onto Naomi's finger. It was heavy and cold, a physical manifestation of his claim. Inside the band, etched in a script only he could fully authorize, was the word mine. Naomi, he whispered, his voice thick with a promise that felt heavier than the ring. From this moment, you are under the protection of the Golden Dragon. But you will never have to see his face. He took her hands in his thumbs grazing her knuckles. This was the moment where the two universes were supposed to fuse, but Ji-Hoon was already building a wall between them. He had realized that to truly love Naomi was to keep her untainted by the blood that stained his own hands. He had spent weeks preparing the legal and physical barriers that would surround her, the shell companies, the anonymous security teams, the curated lies that would keep her life feeling normal. I make this vow to you, he continued, his eyes locking onto hers with a burning sincerity. My world will never touch yours. The shadows I walk in will stop at our doorstep. Within our home, I am just Ji-Hoon. Not a boss, not a strategist, not a legend. Just your husband. Naomi reached up, her palm resting against his cheek, her warmth seeping into his skin. I don't need a protector in a suit, Ji-Hoon. I just need you. Promise me you won't disappear into those shadows so far that I can't find you. I will always come back to the light, he promised, though the weight of the lies sat like lead in his stomach. He knew the world he inhabited didn't allow for clean exits, but he would create a vacuum around her if he had to. He would be the monster at the gate so she could remain the woman in the garden. As they stepped out of the temple and into the cool night air, a fleet of black SUVs waited at the bottom of the stone steps, their engines idling like low-growling beasts. Ji-Hoon's men stood at attention, their heads bowed in a silent show of respect that bordered on worship. Naomi felt a shiver of realization. The sheer scale of his power was becoming harder to ignore, but before she could dwell on it, Ji-Hoon's arm was around her waist, pulling her close. Don't look at them, he murmured into her ear, shielding her vision with his own body. Look at me. In that moment, she chose to believe him. She chose to believe that love could be an island, safe from the storms of the ocean that surrounded it. They drove back toward the city, the Golden Dragon and his bride, moving through the night in a bubble of fragile, beautiful silence. He held her hand the entire way, his grip firm and desperate, as if he were trying to memorize the feeling of peace before the world eventually demanded his return to the war. He had created two universes that night, and for as long as he had breath in his body, he would ensure she never had to cross the border into his. The separate universes Ji-Hoon had painstakingly constructed began to fray not with a bang, but with the quiet, persistent scratching of eyes that lived in the dark. In the underworld, silence is a commodity, but anomalies are a currency. To the rival Lee family, who had watched Ji-Hoon operate with the cold, unyielding precision of a machine for a decade, his sudden softness was a jagged edge that didn't fit the puzzle. Naomi moved through the vibrant streets of Seoul with a freedom that was, in itself, a provocation. She was a woman who walked to the local markets alone, who took the subway during rush hour, and who spent her Saturday morning sketching in the parks of Songpagu. To the casual observer, she was an American expat living a charmed, peaceful life. To the scouts of the Lee faction, she was a ghost, a woman with no visible security, no armored transport, and yet, a woman who lived in a penthouse owned by a shell company linked to the Golden Dragon. The cracks first appeared on a humid Tuesday afternoon. Naomi was at a small, open-air flower stall, debating between lilies and hydrangeas. She didn't notice the silver sedan parked across the street, its engine idling, or the man in the passenger seat who was currently zooming a high-resolution lens onto the platinum band on her finger. The dragon's hoard, the man whispered into a burner phone. He's hidden his gold in plain sight. No guards. No surveillance. Just a girl and her flowers. Across the city, in a dimly lit office smelling of stale tea and old grudges, Elder Lee looked at the digital transmission. He traced the lines of Naomi's face on the screen with a gnarled finger. "He thinks he can keep the sun in a paper box," Lee rasped. "He thinks that by not guarding her, we won't see her. He's forgotten that in our world, anything unprotected is an invitation." Ji-Hoon was not entirely blind to the shift in the atmosphere. He felt the weight of the scrutiny during his board meetings, he saw the subtle, mocking tilts of the heads of his rivals. But he was trapped by his own vow. To place a visible guard around Naomi was to admit she was a target. To pull her into a fortress was to admit his world had bled into hers. He chose to double down on the shadows, increasing the invisible protection, unmarked cars 2 blocks behind her, hacked CCTV feeds that followed her every step. But invisible protection has a fatal flaw: it cannot stop a desperate man from making a visible move. The first real chill reached Naomi on a Thursday evening. She was walking home from a late dinner with a friend when she noticed a man standing under a street lamp, one of the very lights Ji-Hoon had installed for her safety. He wasn't moving. He wasn't on a phone. He was simply staring at her with a blank, hollow expression that made the hair on her arms stand up. As she passed, he didn't look away, he turned his entire body to follow her path, his eyes fixed on her wedding ring. "Beautiful ring," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that broke the quiet of the street. "Must be worth a lot to someone." Naomi quickened her pace, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Thank you," she managed to say, her voice tight. She didn't look back until she reached the lobby of her building, her hands shaking as she fumbled with her keycard. That night, when Ji-Hoon returned home, he found her sitting by the window, the lights in the apartment turned off. The usual warmth that greeted him, the smell of dinner, the soft music, was gone. "Naomi?" he asked, his voice instantly sharp with concern. He moved toward her, his silhouette cutting a dark path through the moonlight. "I felt, watched today, Ji-Hoon," she said, her voice small. "A man. He said something about my ring. It didn't feel like a compliment. It felt like a threat." Ji-Hoon's entire body went still. The monster he kept caged behind his ribs roared, demanding blood. He knelt beside her, taking her cold hands in his thumbs tracing the mine engraving inside her band. He wanted to tell her the truth, that the sharks were circling, that the glass was breaking, but he looked at the fear in her eyes and couldn't bring himself to shatter her universe just yet. "It was likely just a stranger, Naomi," he lied, the words tasting like ash. "The city can be strange at night. I'll make sure the building security stays more alert." He held her until she fell into a fitful sleep, but Ji-Hoon didn't close his eyes. He sat in the dark, watching the door, realizing that his 2 universes were no longer just touching. They were collapsing into each other. The Lee family had seen the light, and now, they were coming to put it out. He had wanted to keep her away from the war, but he realized with a sickening clarity that by marrying her, he hadn't saved her. He had simply made her the most valuable piece on the board. The transition from the uneasy peace of the penthouse to the sterile, echoing halls of Incheon International Airport felt like a bridge to another life. Naomi walked toward Terminal 1 with a light heart, her suitcase trailing behind her like a faithful shadow. She was heading home to Georgia for a surprise visit, carrying a bag full of Korean skincare and silk scarves for her sister. She had kissed Ji-Hoon goodbye that morning, unaware that the lingering press of his lips was a silent prayer for a safety he could no longer guarantee. The airport was a symphony of departures, the chime of boarding calls, the frantic pace of travelers, the smell of expensive coffee. Naomi found a seat near a floor-to-ceiling window, watching the planes rise into the gray Seoul sky. She felt a brief moment of absolute tranquility, a sense of belonging in a world that finally felt stable. Then, the music stopped. It began with a ripple of silence that moved through the crowd like a cold front. Near the luxury boutiques, 3 men in black tactical gear emerged, their faces obscured by ballistic masks. They didn't shout. They didn't wave flags. They moved with the terrifying, synchronized grace of professional executioners. The first shot shattered a nearby digital display, turning the flight schedules into a rain of deadly confetti. Naomi didn't have time to process the sound before the second shot found its mark. A searing, white-hot bloom of pain exploded in her shoulder, throwing her backward against her luggage. The terminal erupted into a chorus of screams. Civilians dove behind benches, shielding children with their bodies as the air filled with the sharp, metallic scent of gunpowder. Naomi lay on the floor, the world tilting on its axis. Her breath came in shallow, ragged hitches, and her patterned blouse, the one Ji-Hoon had complimented that morning, was rapidly turning a deep, wet crimson. Through the haze of shock, she saw the gunmen. They weren't looking for money. They weren't shooting at the police. They were standing over her, their rifles held at low ready, their masked heads tilted as if verifying a kill. They stood there for 3 long seconds, a message sent in blood, before melting back into the panicked crowd as the airport's sirens began their mournful wail. The responding officers arrived minutes later, their boots clicking on the glass-strewn floor. A young officer named Choi knelt beside Naomi, his hands trembling as he applied a pressure bandage to her shoulder. "Stay with me, ma'am. Look at me," he urged in broken English. As he worked to stabilize her, his eyes caught on something tucked into the side pocket of her carry-on. It was a custom-made leather passport wallet, tossed aside during the struggle. When it fell open, the light caught a silver emblem embossed on the interior flap, a coiled, elegant golden dragon. Officer Choi froze. The air in his lungs seemed to solidify. Every cop in Seoul knew that mark. It was the sigil of a man who existed above the law, a man whose shadow governed the streets they patrolled. "Detective!" Choi called out, his voice cracking. "Look at the identification." The lead detective approached, his face grim until he saw the wallet. He reached out and carefully lifted Naomi's hand to check for a pulse, and that was when he saw it, the platinum wedding band. He turned it slightly, his eyes widening as he read the engraving, "Mine." "This isn't a random act of violence," the detective whispered, a chill of pure dread settling over him. "This is a declaration of war." He looked at the unconscious woman on the floor, her mahogany skin pale from blood loss. She looked so ordinary, so innocent, lying amidst the ruins of her travel plans. He realized then that the men who had pulled those triggers hadn't just shot a civilian, they had punctured the thin veil between 2 universes. As the paramedics loaded Naomi onto a gurney, the detective pulled out his radio. He didn't call the station. He didn't call the morgue. He called the special task force with a shaking hand. "Clear the route to the hospital," he barked. "And God help us all. Inform the ministry. Someone just tried to kill Park Ji-Hoon's wife. By sunset, this city is going to burn." Naomi was rushed toward the exit, the rhythmic thud of the gurney wheels echoing like a countdown. Far away, in a narrow urban alley, a man in a sharp black suit stopped mid-stride, his phone vibrating with a notification that would change everything. The golden dragon was no longer sleeping, and the piece Naomi had fought for was dead on the terminal floor. The vibration of the phone against Ji-Hoon's chest didn't just signal a message, it signaled the end of the world he had tried to build. When he looked at the encrypted image sent by his head of security, a grainy shot of the airport terminal floor covered in white luggage and red stains, the cold strategist died. The man who calculated risks, who weighed percentages, and who maintained a mask of intentional, expensive minimalism evaporated, replaced by something ancient and hollow. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He simply turned and walked toward the curb, his posture so rigid it felt as though the air around him was freezing. By the time he reached the sidewalk, for black SUVs had already screeched to a halt, smoking tires leaving black scars on the pavement. His men piled out, their faces pale, seeing the transformation in their boss. Ji-Hoon didn't look at them. He climbed into the lead vehicle and uttered a single word that sounded like the snapping of bone, Incheon. The drive to the airport was a blur of high-speed maneuvers and sirens, but inside the car, there was a terrifying, absolute silence. Ji-Hoon sat in the back, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes fixed forward. He wasn't thinking about the Lee family's provocation or the political fallout of a public shooting. He was thinking about the way Naomi had laughed that morning when he couldn't find his keys. He was thinking about the warmth of her skin. When the convoy arrived at the airport, it didn't stop at the designated drop-off. The lead SUV smashed through the security bollards, drifting to a stop directly in front of the terminal's shattered glass doors. Ji-Hoon stepped out. The airport police, already on edge, raised their weapons, but they lowered them the moment they saw him. It wasn't just the suit or the reputation, it was the aura of incoming consequence that radiated from him. He walked through the terminal like a ghost moving through a graveyard. He didn't look at the panicked travelers or the flashing lights. His eyes were locked on the spot where the yellow police tape circled a dark, wet patch on the floor. He stepped over the tape. He knelt. He touched the tile with his bare hand, his fingers coming away stained with the blood he had promised to never let spill. "The footage," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried to every corner of the silent hall. The lead detective approached him, sweating despite the air conditioning. "Mr. Park, we are handling." Ji-Hoon stood up and turned. The detective choked on his next word. Ji-Hoon's eyes were no longer those of a businessman, they were the eyes of a predator who had just watched his only light be extinguished. The footage. Now. 10 minutes later, in the airport's high-security surveillance room, Ji-Hoon watched the monitors. He watched the three masked men emerge. He watched Naomi fall. He watched the way the gunman lingered for 3 seconds. He didn't blink. He watched the clip 10 times, his mind deconstructing the way the attackers moved, the way they held their rifles, the specific tactical signatures of their formation. "Contract operatives," Ji-Hoon murmured, his voice a low, terrifying growl. Lee didn't send his own. He hired the shadows. He turned to his head of security, who was standing at the door. "Seal the city. No one leaves. No private docks, no airfields, no mountain passes. I want every man who has ever taken a contract from the Lee family brought to the warehouse in Incheon. And the Lee family themselves, sir." Ji-Hoon adjusted the cuff of his black suit, his expression returning to a mask of terrifying calm, the calm of a man who had already decided everyone was dead. "Do not touch them yet. I want them to watch. I want them to see what happens when they reach into my universe." As he walked back out toward the tarmac where his private helicopter was landing to ferry him to the hospital, Ji-Hoon felt the last of his restraint snap. He had tried to be the man Naomi deserved, the man who stayed in the light. But the world had demanded the dragon. He climbed into the helicopter, the roar of the blades drowning out the sirens of the city below. He looked down at Seoul, the city he had governed with shadows, and felt a cold, primal hunger. He wasn't going to just find the men who shot his wife. He was going to erase the very ground they stood on. The strategist was gone. The hunter had begun his work. The Seoul Metropolitan Hospital had been transformed into a fortress. Every entrance was flanked by men in dark turtlenecks whose silence was more intimidating than the sirens echoing through the city. Inside, the sterile scent of antiseptic was choked out by the heavy, metallic tension radiating from the private wing. Ji-Hoon stood behind the observation glass of the surgical suite, his reflection ghosting over the image of Naomi's still form. She looked fragile, her mahogany skin stark against the white sheets, tubes and monitors weaving a web around the woman who had once been his only tether to the light. The doctors had removed the bullet, but the damage to her shoulder, and the shock to her system, had left her suspended in a precarious sleep. Behind him, the heavy double doors opened. His head of security, a man whose knuckles were fresh with the evidence of a forced confession, bowed low. "We have him. The warehouse in Incheon, as you requested." Ji-Hoon didn't look back. "And the others?" "Erased," the man replied. "But the mastermind, we kept him awake for you." Ji-Hoon turned slowly. The calculated strategist was nowhere to be found. In his place was a hollow-eyed vessel of retribution. He moved through the hospital corridors like a winter wind, arriving at a restricted basement level where the Lee family's primary enforcer, the man who had coordinated the airport hit, was chained to a steel chair. The room smelled of damp concrete and iron. The enforcer was a man who had built a career on fear, but as Ji-Hoon stepped into the light, the prisoner's bravado vanished. Ji-Hoon didn't use a blade. He didn't use a gun. He simply stood over the man, his shadow swallowing the room, and spoke in a voice that was barely a whisper, yet carried the weight of a funeral shroud. "You took a shot at the sun," Ji-Hoon said, his fingers tightening around a heavy industrial wrench. "Did you think I wouldn't leave you in the dark?" For the next hour, the warehouse echoed with the sounds of a man being systematically dismantled, not just physically, but psychologically. Ji-Hoon worked with a cold, surgical detachment, extracting every name, every bank account, and every hidden safe house belonging to the Lee family. He wasn't just seeking revenge, he was preparing to excise a cancer from the city. By the time he was finished, the enforcer was a sobbing wreck, and Ji-Hoon's white shirt was stained with the proof of his descent. He returned to the hospital just as the sun began to bleed over the horizon. He didn't change. He didn't wash. He walked into Naomi's room, his presence a dark blot against the morning light. The heart monitor's steady beep-beep shifted, accelerating. Naomi's eyelids fluttered, her brow furrowing in pain. Her eyes opened, slowly, hazily, searching for the face that had always been her sanctuary. "Ji-Hoon," she rasped, her voice a dry thread. He moved to her side, reaching out to take her hand. But as he leaned into the light, the reality of what he had become was laid bare. The blood on his collar hadn't dried. His eyes, usually filled with a guarded warmth when he looked at her, were cold, bottomless pits of obsidian. The monster he had spent 3 years hiding behind curtains of silk and lies was standing right in front of her. Naomi's breath caught. She didn't see the husband who had bought her flowers or the man who had whispered, "Mine," in the quiet of the night. She saw a predator. She saw the golden dragon, in all his terrifying, primal glory. She flinched, a small, involuntary movement, but to Ji-Hoon, it felt like a gunshot. Her fingers, weak as they were, recoiled from his touch. What did you do?" she whispered, her eyes wide with a new kind of terror. "Ji-Hoon, your eyes. I don't know who you are." Ji-Hoon froze, his hands suspended in the air between them. The separate universes had finally collided, and in the wreckage, he realized the truth. He had saved her life, but in doing so, he might have lost her soul. He stood there, a man of infinite power and zero mercy, realizing that the one thing he couldn't protect her from was himself. "I did what I had to do to keep you," he said, the words sounding like a confession and a curse. Naomi looked away, tears tracking through the hospital grime on her cheeks. At what cost? The question hung in the room like smoke. For the first time in his life, the most feared man in Korea had no answer. He stood in the shadows of the room, watching the woman he loved fear him more than the men who had shot her. The choice of retribution had been made, but the price was only beginning to be tallied. The silence in the hospital room was more oppressive than the sirens that still wailed in the distance. Ji-Hoon remained anchored to the shadows near the foot of the bed, his silhouette sharp and jagged, like a blade forced into a space too small for it. He watched Naomi, his chest tight with a desperation he didn't know how to voice. He had spent his entire life mastering the language of force, but here, in the presence of her quiet, trembling resolve, he was a man without a tongue. Naomi didn't look at him at first. She stared at the foredrip, the rhythmic ticking of the heart monitor, the only thing tethering her to the present. The scent of him, smoke, expensive cologne, and the metallic tang of something she refused to name, filled the small space. It was the scent of the man who had just dismantled an empire for her, and it terrified her. "I saw the news on the television before they turned it off," she said, her voice a fragile whisper that nonetheless commanded the air. "A warehouse fire in Incheon. A gangland execution in the docks. They say the city is on the brink of a war that will burn down half of Seoul." Ji-Hoon didn't move. "They struck first, Naomi. They tried to take you from me. In my world, if you do not answer blood with a flood, you invite every shark in the ocean to your door. Then your world is a graveyard, Ji-Hoon," she snapped, her head turning toward him, her eyes bright with tears and a sudden, fierce clarity. "You told me you were a strategist. You told me you solved problems. But all I see is a man making more problems out of bodies. Is this what our life is going to be? Me bleeding on airport floors while you play God with a wrench and a gun?" Ji-Hoon stepped into the light, his face a mask of tortured stoicism. "I am doing this to ensure it never happens again. I am ending the threat." "You aren't ending it," Naomi countered, struggling to sit up despite the flare of pain in her shoulder. "You're feeding it. You kill Ali, and a son or a brother rises to kill you. And then they come for me again. And then you kill them. It's a circle, Ji-Hoon. It's a noose." She reached out, her good hand trembling as she gestured toward the door. "Out there, your men are waiting for the order to start the final massacre. I can feel them. They're waiting for the dragon to burn the city. But if you walk out that door and give that order, don't bother coming back to this room." Ji-Hoon's breath hitched. "Naomi, you don't understand the politics of—" "I understand love," she interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "And I understand that I cannot love a ghost. If you choose this path, this scorched earth, you might save my life, but you will lose me. I won't be the trophy at the end of a war. I won't be the reason 1,000 people lose their fathers and husbands tonight." She looked him directly in the eye, the lightning he had seen in her during their first meeting in the alleyway flashing once more. "This is my ultimatum, Ji-Hoon. End this cycle. Not with more blood, but with the power you claim to have. Use your mind, not your monsters. Be the man who protects the city, not the one who burns it. If you choose vengeance tonight, you lose me even if I live. I will go back to Atlanta, and I will never look back." Ji-Hoon stood frozen. The golden dragon, the man who had never been told no, found himself at a precipice. To show mercy was to show weakness in the eyes of his enemies. To let the Lee family live was a strategic nightmare. But as he looked at Naomi, at the woman who had treated his wounds when he was a nameless stranger, who had given him a home that wasn't a fortress, he realized that his power was a cage. He looked at his hands, still shadowed by the night's work. For 3 years, he had kept his universes separate. He realized now that he couldn't hide the monster from her anymore, he had to kill the monster for her. "If I stop," Ji-Hoon said, his voice cracking, "it will take everything I have built to keep us safe legally. I will have to dismantle the empire. I will have to become ordinary." "I never fell in love with an empire," Naomi whispered, her expression softening just enough to let him in. "I fell in love with the man in the rain." Ji-Hoon lowered his head. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his encrypted phone, the one that held the power to start a war with a single text. He looked at it for a long moment, the weight of a decade of blood on his thumb. Then, he tapped the screen, sending a message to his entire network: stand down. Full transition to Protocol White. No more blood. He dropped the phone into the bedside pitcher of water, watching the screen flicker and die. He turned back to Naomi, the darkness in his eyes finally receding, replaced by a hollow, aching hope. The war is over, he said quietly. Naomi let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for years. She reached out her hand, and this time, when he took it, she didn't flinch. He sat on the edge of the bed, the most feared man in Korea, leaning his forehead against the hand of an American nurse, finally surrendering to the only force stronger than his hate. The transition from a world of shadows to one of blinding, beautiful light took exactly 3 years of relentless reconstruction. It was a period defined not by the pull of a trigger, but by the stroke of a pen and the dismantling of a legacy. The Golden Dragon did not fall, he evolved. The illicit territories, the backroom deals, and the blood-stained ledgers were methodically purged, replaced by the foundations of Global Aegis, a high-end security and community-focused firm that protected people legally, with the same terrifying efficiency that Ji-Hoon had once used to rule them. The spring air in Seoul's Olympic Park was crisp, carrying the scent of cherry blossoms and damp earth. It was a Saturday afternoon, the kind of day Ji-Hoon once viewed only from behind tinted windows or through the lens of a sniper's scope. Now, he walked through the open grass, his posture still upright and composed, but the calculated strategist had finally allowed his shoulders to drop. He wore a simple dark sweater and slacks, no armor, no hidden blades, just a man enjoying the sun. Naomi walked beside him, her hand tucked firmly into the crook of his arm. Her recovery had been long, leaving a thin, silver scar on her shoulder that she wore like a badge of honor. She no longer looked for shadows when she crossed the street. The willful blindness of her past had been replaced by a grounded, resilient peace. She knew exactly who her husband was, and more importantly, she knew who he had chosen to become for her. She's getting faster, Naomi said, her voice rich with a happiness that no longer felt fragile. Ji-Hoon's gaze shifted to the small, energetic figure sprinting toward a cluster of pigeons a few yards ahead. Gia Grace was 2 years old, a perfect, chaotic blend of her parents. She had Naomi's deep mahogany skin and fierce, bright eyes, paired with Ji-Hoon's stubborn chin and focused intensity. She moved with a fearless grace, unaware that her very existence was the greatest victory her father had ever won. Gia tripped over a stray root, tumbling onto the grass. Before the nearest, invisible, security guard, now a legitimate employee of a legal firm, could even twitch, Ji-Hoon was already there. He knelt in the dirt, his large, scarred hands gently brushing the grass from his daughter's knees. He didn't check for a wound with a strategist's eye, he checked with a father's heart. "Up you go, little dragon," Ji-Hoon murmured, his voice a low, warm rumble. He lifted her easily, settling her against his chest. Gia giggled, tugging at his hair with sticky fingers, and for the 1000th time, Ji-Hoon marveled at the fact that he was allowed to feel this. Naomi caught up to them, leaning her head against Ji-Hoon's shoulder. They stood there for a long moment, a family framed by the very public they had once lived apart from. The people walking past saw only a handsome couple and their beautiful child, they didn't see the blood that had been washed away or the war that had been averted. They didn't see the man who had traded an empire for a walk in the park. "You're thinking again," Naomi teased, poking his side. "I can see the gears turning. Are you calculating the wind speed or the perimeter security?" Ji-Hoon looked at her, his dark eyes softening into a gaze that held only her. He reached out and touched the platinum band on her finger, the word "mine" still etched inside, though its meaning had transformed from a claim of possession to a vow of partnership. "Neither," he said, his English perfect and light. "I was calculating how long it will take for her to want a dog." My projections say by dinner. Naomi laughed, a sound that echoed the music of that first alleyway meeting. You and your projections. You're probably right. As the sun began to dip behind the Seoul skyline, casting long, golden shadows across the park, they turned to walk home. They weren't hiding anymore. They weren't moving through the dark. They were simply three people walking toward a future that was no longer a secret. The Golden Dragon was a legend of the past, a story told in whispers by men who still lived in fear. But here, in the light, there was only Ji-Hoon, Naomi, and the daughter who was their legacy of grace. The universes had finally merged, and for the first time in his life, Park Ji-Hoon was exactly where he was meant to be. Naomi and Ji-Hoon traded a kingdom of shadows for a single walk in the light, but was the price of peace too high? If you believe love can truly change even the darkest soul, hit that like button and subscribe to join our community. What would you do if you discovered your partner had a secret this dangerous? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss the next chapter of an impossible love.